Foundation.
Thanks for being here, Jeannie. Jeff, do you want to go next?
Jeff Drazen, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, professor at Harvard, interested in asthma, and I was co-chair of the drug forum for 6 years, sometime with Steve.
Terrific. Let's see who we've got next. Nadine, would you mind going next, please?
Sure, absolutely. Nadine Barrett, Assistant Professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at Duke, and Associate Director for both the Duke Cancer Institute and for the Duke Clinical Translation Science Institute as Associate Director of Equity, Stakeholder Engagement, and Strategy. And I'm a health disparities researcher and equity strategist.
Terrific. Thanks, Nadine. Jonathan T.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Tobin. I'm a cardiovascular epidemiologist and I'm an implementation scientist. I'm the president and CEO of Clinical Directors Network, which is a primary care practice-based research network that works with federally qualified health centers and other safety net practices. We're in New York City and we work with practices across the country. I'm also a senior epidemiologist and co-director for community engaged research at the Rockefeller University Center for Clinical and Translational Science. In this work, the collaboration between the CTSA and a practice-based research network, we build these full-spectrum translational research studies that combine comparative effectiveness research and patient-centered outcomes research with embedded mechanistic questions at the T1 level and implementation science questions at the T4 level.
Terrific. Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan Watanabe.
Jonathan Watanabe. I serve on the Forum of Drug Discovery, Development, and Translation with Steve and Jeff. I'm also the Associate Dean of Assessment and Quality, University of California, Irvine School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, and spent a lot of my time looking at large databases and real-world data to look at how we can improve outcomes. And as part of the Real-World Evidence Workshop Series, spent a lot of time thinking about how we can improve kind of the speed and success and accrual of pragmatic clinical trials and clinical trials in general. I'll just keep it to that.
Terrific. We'll get into more as we go, I'm sure. Peyton, you're next.
Sure. Peyton Howell, Chief Commercial and Strategy Officer at Parexel, one of the large CROs. My role includes clinical trial diversity, but I'm actually representing the board of ACRO, which is the Association for Clinical Research Organizations.
Terrific. Stephanie, I remember from earlier that you are on here helping us with all the tech. Is there anyone else I may have missed that I should have called on? Okay, terrific. So our charge for this conversation, funnily enough, is actually the same two questions. So that's sort of what does good look like question around what are the goals we should be setting ourselves, and then what are the tools and sort of mechanisms that we need to put in place in order to achieve those goals. The time horizon is different. So before we were looking for those aggressive sort of short-term goals, holding ourselves accountable for the sort of 1 to 2 year mark. And now we're really looking out over the time horizon of this whole sort of workshop series, which is, let's imagine now it's 2023. What are the, at that point, what does good look like? What are the goals that we should be setting ourselves at this point in order to sort of really manifest transformational change in that period of time, and what do we need to do in order to get there? And I'm going to share a couple of things maybe to seed some conversation. As I said, I'm conscious it's the same question, so let me see if I can sort of probe this a little. I think it's a Bill Gates quote, which is, we often overestimate what we can do in the next year or so, but vastly underestimate what we can do in a 10-year time frame. And I think that may be helpful for us to keep in mind. I also, one of the things that really impressed me about this group this morning, as we had the breakout session, was that even with the short-term goals, there was a recognition that what we mean by clinical trials and how we conduct them may be changing. Whether it's more decentralized approaches, whether it's broader use of real-world data and evidence, whether it's more community-based approaches, that was really front of mind. So I wonder if we could start there. What does it mean to do a clinical trial in 10 years' time? And then let's start thinking about goals for inclusivity and diversity. Let's actually define for ourselves, for the purpose, a straw man for the purposes of this conversation, what does it mean to do a clinical trial in 2030?
I would throw out that there's an interest in developing hybrid effectiveness and implementation trials, and I think the merger of the concept of hybrid effectiveness implementation trials that look at outcomes related not only to clinical effectiveness, but also to implementation. And if we think of every multi-site clinical trial as really looking at variation in implementation, but not necessarily making that a primary objective of the study, we need to understand those implementation variables as much as we need to understand clinical variables. And then related to that would be the notion that if we want things to be implemented and sustained, they have to be practical, and we have to focus on pragmatic design. So the recommendation for trials in 2030 would be the high focus on pragmatic studies that look at both implementation outcomes and effectiveness outcomes.
So I would add to that, say that every clinical trial, whether funded by federal agencies or industry, has at the table in this early phase design patients and patient advocates, so that we have a shift of culture that indicates that the patient is not just the subject, but is also part of defining the research agenda. And, you know, when applications come in and they clearly don't have that in it, then there will be, you know, sticks and carrots in the funding arena to actually push that culture change. That is a huge culture change, and it needs to be supported by, you know, carrots, incentives.
It even seems that need to take that a step further. Not only should patients be involved in the design and the issues of implementation, but communities. I think what we've been hearing steadily for diversity is that we need diverse set of patients that are involved, not just all from one group, but a diverse set. And then, and it needs to be, if you want to have a goal of achieving a mix of population that looks like those that, say, a treatment that's being studied is going to ultimately treat, then you need to make sure you're involving those communities that are in that mix of patients who will be treated. And, I think that as we think about the network, when we go beyond the design elements, right, it's how do you make this practical? And what I think we've been hearing steadily is that it has to have a community basis to it. There has to be an ability to work with investigators who have the trust of that community because they're embedded in that community and they care about that community, and that community then cares about them. That seems to me that network of community-based clinical research centers is going to be key for involvement. And I think finally the other element we need to consider here is the digital technologies that can make access almost anywhere where there's a patient be able to participate in a trial through decentralization that we've heard, right? So to me, that's kind of the picture that we should be trying to achieve.
This is Nadine. I'd like to just add to that as well. So I think that when we talk about engaging our patients, and most certainly when we talk about engaging our community, which is critical to me, I think that part of that conversation cannot happen without us talking about equitable, robust, sustainable investment in the community. And that means resources, finances, all of those things are critical, because I think that people do a bit of each of what we've described here and there. But in most of those cases, the concept of equity and equitable in resources and finances are not part of the forefront. So we really don't see our patients and our community as true experts, that without them, we cannot accomplish this. And so I really think that it's so critical that we really incorporate in that dialogue investment, financial investment in our community-based and community-rooted organizations who can do a lot of this work better than we can in the research enterprise.
This is Jeannie. I'm always adding to what Nadine is saying. She's so smart. There's a National Health Council fair market value calculator, which is relevant for activities where patients are involved. So patients should be paid as experts, just like everybody pays a consultant for their input. There needs to be some urgency to use that calculator. It was independently put together with a lot of patient organization and also pharmaceutical company input. It's a free calculator. I spend a lot of time passing that around because a lot of people aren't used to seeing it or don't even know that it exists, but it's on their website. The one thing I want to say about the clinical trial design of the future is that my wish and my hope is that before a trial is even envisioned, that all the stakeholders get in the room together and design it. People, process, technology, decision rights. What we have now is an infrastructure with a bunch of handoffs, with a number of assumptions, with input being given. Every stakeholder should hear the patient or community input. So let's design a trial with everybody in the room. So sponsor, clinical site head, community groups, patient organizations, the CRO who's hired to do and implement the trial, the IRB, everybody. And let's design the trial from beginning to end with everybody in the room. And it might have a chance of happening better.
I wanted to focus on a specific subset of the suggestions that most of you have made around investments, and that is the workforce that conducts clinical trials. It is still not very diverse, and I don't think a lot of these things can happen without one of our investments being in more diverse clinical trial workforce, from the very top of the pyramid of the physicians to all the other people involved. I think those of you in medicine are aware that really the medical schools have failed more or less in increasing diversity in the physician group. It's not like there's no progress, but we're still way, way, way down. So I wanted to highlight that.
So there is, as in most things, a National Academies committee, the standing committee that is addressing this. It's called the Round Table on Black Men and Black Women in Science, Medicine, and Engineering. And we've been working towards coming up with some strategies to address this. But I think overall, what this needs to happen is that we now at a point where it's not just a pipeline problem, that we must enhance the diversity in the faculty, and that requires a systematic approach of an integrated set of things, led with a leader committed to putting incentives around it, and with NIH and other funders who are the ultimate holders of the levers also putting incentive out. Without it, we'll be still here, 20 years time, I'll be gone, but
yeah, those are great points.
Those are the things.
We can't leave it up to the medical schools because they've failed. But
we can hold them accountable.
Yeah.
Yep. Think about all the funding that goes out of various federal agencies if it was required to make that shift rapidly, and by the way, to make sure that the assistant professors being hired are going to be working in this community-based research, then we'll have some change.
Yep, agree.
Can I just add to that? I could not agree more in terms of the importance of the diversity of the workforce. I think, and I think this other piece around accountability is so critical as well, both for medical schools and other spaces in which people are coming up and engaging in clinical studies and trials. I can't help but ask or think about what that space will look like, as you just asked, Jan, in the next few years. And Dr. Valentine, I think you really hit it on the nail in terms of a culture shift. And so when we think about what are the things that shifts our culture, right, then therefore looks at all these practices, policies, behaviors, that's all kind of embedded in within that. And the culture kind of keeps it all together, if you will, and keeps it running in that same direction. I can't help but say that if we think about all of the ways in which systemically, culturally, people of color are not engaged in clinical research and trials, from everything from our practices and our policies at the institutional level and at the PI level, the institutional level, and the federal level, if we really want to make that shift, I think we need to do an honest systemic examination of all those factors that are playing a part in it, and then be prepared to disrupt and dismantle it, and moving us to a space where we really are making a difference, and not doing like Band-Aids here or there on these different things, but really and truly, I envision a space where we have done such an assessment of it and really willing to disrupt these types of policies and practices that are really, I think someone said it in our earlier session, this is an equity issue. This is a social justice issue. So if we're not willing to disrupt those things and really look at them, analyze them, and then put into place the appropriate processes to disrupt them and help us to change course, I don't think we would ever do it. We will never really make the kind of move we want. So that's what I envision as a place where we actually have done the assessment, and years down the line, we can look back and say, wow, we saw the policies, we made the changes, we had federal government make the appropriate accountability mechanisms that really both sets people up for success, but also leads to the type of diversity that we're now wanting to see years later down the line. So I think that there's an element of that that's so important as well.
So I would disagree with all of that, except I would just worry about analysis leading to paralysis.
Yeah.
We know a lot of these things that contribute to the culture. We now know how to deal with it, and we need the will, the resources, and the incentives. I mean, there's been a lot of study of the problem, and quite frankly, I think we can be held back by just further analysis.
Agreed. And I didn't mean necessarily for us to spend a lot of time on analyzing it, but more looking at what we already know and changing it. There's tons of literature out there of what it is. It's just a matter of disrupting it to kind of create that change.
Yeah, this is Keith Ferdinand. I have a life experience. I'm at Tulane now, which is a major white institution in New Orleans, which from its beginning, when BIMBO founded in 1619, has been a majority minority city. It's founded by the French, built by free Africans and African slaves and people from the Caribbean. There has not been really any significant movement in the number of people of African descent in these major institutions, and the trials really are not increasing in terms of their proportion. It's a carrot and a stick. Probably you need a stick. I don't think goodwill is going to come into play. If you look at the NHLBI, when they mandated in their big trials on hypertension and lipids that the proportion of minorities be increased, they actually had targets. They pushed for them. Sometimes it was short, but there was as much as 35, 40% African-American participation in trials like all had. I was on the Data Safety Monitoring Board. I know those data. It's not improving. It's not going to improve. It's dismal. I don't think goodwill is going to make a difference. The CROs and the academic centers enroll patients as quickly as they can. They really don't care. And they're not going to do it because it's the right thing to do. They know this. This has been going on for decades. All Hat was published in 2004. AHEalth was published in 2004. I mean, this is not anything new. Probably you're going to have federal funds mandate that if a trial is going to be in a disease state where you have a disproportionality of certain racial ethnic groups, that group be represented at a higher rate than in the general population in order to make the data significant. And we just don't see it. It's not happening.
You're right on target, and I think we can take a look at the PCORI experience because prior to PCORI, relatively few projects that went to NIH had any meaningful level of patient engagement, and it was very clear at the beginning that without a significant and meaningful description of how patients are to be engaged, how stakeholders more broadly, good projects with really good scientific aims, rigorous methodology, good teams still didn't get funded until people like me came to understand, what does patient engagement, what does meaningful engagement mean, what does it mean at all stages from development to dissemination. And so it really took that level, almost a regulatory level, saying we're not going to fund projects no matter how good they are. I was also a PI on All Hat. The aim was 55% African American recruitment. It didn't quite reach that, but it aligned the practice with the population in a way that other trials just really haven't done.
And I think there needs to be a dispelling of the myth that, African American and other groups just are not interested in clinical trials. They have legitimate questions that need to be answered, especially in the context of the terrible things that have happened in the future, but that there isn't such a innate sort of mistrust, innate aversion to clinical trials. As an example, I set up a cohort of heart and lung transplant patients in the DC area, and it's 40% African American in the cohort of 500 patients. And that was without sort of any specific major effort or mandating or anything, but maybe it speaks to the leadership coming from communities, from a community of color. So,
yeah, I would be cautious a little bit about trying to say that the road is to establish mandates first. I think we have to solve the underlying issues first. We need to be in the communities. We need to deal with the trust, and we need to deal with access, and we need to deal with these things because, if you put in a mandate before you fix these things, then all we'll have is paralysis of the entire clinical trial enterprise. You gotta fix the things. And I think, Hannah, what you just said shows that it can be done if it's done right, if you work through the right mechanisms in order to achieve it. And it takes a will. It does take a will. But, I'm concerned if we turn to mandates as the sole solution here.
We can do both, though. We can have carrots and sticks at the same time. We don't have to do it sequentially.
I'm listening carefully to this, and I'm learning a lot. And it seems like there's absolutely no room for sort of a single silver bullet strategy. It's going to have to be multi-pronged. It's going to have to be coordinated. I think what I'm struggling with is not to undermine the fantastic points that everyone has made, but I've heard them many times. And I want to go back to, Keith, what you were saying around like how there's just been a persistence with this problem. I think as a field, we are very good at admiring the problem. And I think this gets a little bit to, should we run some more analysis? Because that's what we do.
Well,
like, how do we move?
Well, I have been on steering committees and led multiple trials. I have done back-to-back trials in diabetes, heart failure, hypertension, and I've always been a big enroller because I'm from the neighborhood. People know me. If you don't have that concordance with the clinical investigator and the population, you should at least have staff. You should have clinical liaisons, nurses, community health workers. You have to build it in. They know this, though. If you look at the numbers, the number of Black men in medical school hasn't changed since the 1990s. In terms of professors here at Tulane, it's myself, and I'm struggling to think who else. And this is in a city that's like 60. Before Katrina was 78%. A lot of us didn't come back. Now it's 60% African American. Big institution. You see it all the time when you come downtown. It's crazy. I just think that this country is uglier and nastier and more racist than most of us would like to believe. And okay, carrots and sticks, mandates won't work, but I don't think we're going to do a lot of goodwill because this goodwill thing ain't working. And I'm sorry if I sound harsh. This is from deep, decades-long observation of what goes on in this society.
And if you want to be academic about it, you just look at the behavioral science research. In order to change behavior, you have to change the incentive structure. education on racism and bias and how to intervene will only go so far. We're talking about behavior change, which my understanding of the literature has to be incentivized or disincentivized.
Keith, I really appreciate your frank comments, because I think we have to be this sort of honest with each other in order to make any progress. I'm going to go in a very different direction to you, Hannah, and go not academic at all. I'm not sure how many people watched the Super Bowl the other night. I just about choked on my beer as the NFL pledge for $250 million to promote equity and justice came on, because all I could think of the whole time I've lived in the US is how badly they've treated players who used the league as a platform to actually champion equity and justice. That said, in the same way we don't let a good crisis go to waste, there is a moment potentially to affect some of the change and some of the persistent resistance we've seen to actually moving the needle on this. I wonder, I'm drawing from the NFL, but I think that speaks to a broader movement that, like, for the first time, potentially people are open to having a conversation that they've never been interested to before. The level of how genuine it is, I don't really care. If they can bring them to the table, we can. How do we use that to make the difference, Keith, in the enrollment in medical schools that we haven't seen change since 1990? Like, what are the strategies that we can use, given that we might have a friendlier ear than we've ever had before?
I don't have any easy answers. Most schools have a health equity officer. We have one here, and she works out of the dean's office. There are some small numbers increase in people of disadvantaged racial groups that happen in the institution, but it's not an exponential growth. It's not enough that would reverse the pathway to enrolling people in clinical trials, because you have more principal investigators from disadvantaged groups. I mean, that's 15 years down the road. So none of that's going to make a difference. If you're talking about clinical trials, I think you have to build into it. If you don't want to use the word mandate, because most people in America think that there's freedom here. So it's freedom to not wear a mask. It's freedom to cough on somebody. It's freedom to speed and drunk driving. Everything's a freedom. So if you don't want to do mandates, then we have to at least ask pharmaceutical industries that they have a proportionality and representation, or their trial may not be approved. The proportionality, for instance, in diabetes, in the general population is 8 to 9%, African-American population is 14, 15%, Hispanic population 16, 17%. If you look at all the SGLT2, GLP-1 agonists, all of those trials, the proportion of Hispanic, Latinx, African-Americans is about 3, 4, 5%. And now we're going to, go forth into a community that's disadvantaged with diabetes. The same is true with heart failure. I mean, I don't get it. I'll sit here and listen, but I actually don't get it, because these data are very clear. I can sit here and quote them for the next 2 hours, and I think the people who run studies know this. We had an all-hat investigator who spoke up, so that was known by the people with all-hat, and they did everything they could. We got it to 36%, but at least they knew it and they worked on it. So it's not a lack of knowledge. I mean, this hasn't been known. This is known.
So we have data. I'm gonna really push us here to specifics. We have data, and Steve, I'm gonna look for your help a little bit here. At what level does rulemaking to that effect need to happen? Is that something that could fall under the FDA's remit to look after public health, and they could make a regulation? Is this, they're drafting Cures 2.0 now. Is this something in Cures 2.0? Like, very specifically, we may have a window here. What do we do?
Well, the fastest way for putting my Washington hat on would be for Congress to mandate something and then have the FDA or NIH or both be the implementing agencies. They may have to write rules, but it would have the force of a direction from Congress. That's the smoothest, most legally defensible way to effect a change like this. And it's not impossible. I mean, if you look at the congressional legislation over the last 20 years, having to do with pharmaceuticals, there have been substantial, meaningful pieces of legislation. These issues, though, haven't been included, with rare exception. So there is a path. It's been used before. We know how to do it.
How about a
So
follow-up?
The will may not be there.
But Steve, be clear, are you talking about congressional mandates for medical education, or are you talking congressional mandates for specific targets in clinical trials?
It could be either or both or more, right? Congress can do a lot of stuff. The federal government funds medical education. They fund clinical trials. They fund drugs, most pharmaceuticals at this point. So the potential remit is huge. I don't think we should just say, oh, well, we can't do anything. Congress has to do it. There's still a lot of things that could be done. Frankly, I think that FDA could, through rulemaking with its current authorities, but of course I'm not there anymore, and probably people would disagree with me. But if you want to be absolutely sure, Congress could specify it.
So there's a lot of hiding behind, laws like Atarand and, the not being able to fund based on race, and whereas it's actually happening in the other direction. There's a lot of, head in the sand, using the legal issues as the challenge, where in fact, it's not clear to me that there are legal laws that actually prohibit doing exactly what we are all talking about here. In fact, I would argue that there's, precedent to do it. And I'm hoping that with the new administration, we might have a more restrictive environment to bring these kinds of things to the fore.
I think we need to follow Suttons Law.
I don't know it.
You don't know Suttons Law?
I don't.
Willie Sutton was a bank robber, and when asked why,
tell me more.
That's where the money is.
That's where the money is. And I think that we just simply have to get the FDA and the NIH to say that when you have a new drug, you're putting in an NDA, that the fractions of people with this disease in the population need to be similar to the fractions of the people in your clinical trials. And with that sort of mandate, the second thing we need to do is to get the NIH to begin to support investigators in this area. It only takes maybe 7 years, not 15 years, to bring people up. And it's actually a dual-pronged problem, because even those of us among us who are kind of white male majorities are finding that it's hard to get people to go into clinical trials because it's a hard area to make a long-term living in. But I think that if we had that type of mandate, we would see people representing the broad spectrum of patients enrolling as clinical trials, learning how to be clinical trialists in various areas. That's what we need. We need to have enough of a mandate so that there's a reason to go into this as a career. And when you go into it as a career, you work with your community. Just as you have, Dr. Ferdinand, you have worked with your community to bring patients to clinical trials, not only because it's what you need for your personal clinical advancement, but it's to advance the health of that aspect of the population that you've done that. And people need to see that there is a benefit to that long term. And with that sort of thing, it can happen, but it's not going to happen quickly. But we do need to put the money there so that people see this is a long-term viable career. Without that, it's not.
Yeah, I would like to follow up that, yes, where the money is and where we need to invest, and we need to invest in the communities. We need to invest in minority education. We need to invest in getting medical schools to say that, you know what, we'll give you extra money for every minority graduate you have. We need to create the positive incentives here that create the right path for this to occur. I can tell you that within the pharmaceutical industry, it's been a complete revolution in the last year to really make this a major issue that we want to solve. And I can only tell you that if suddenly the FDA requires a mandate that you haven't yet fixed the underlying issues, drugs will be delayed to patients, including those patients in the underserved communities who need those drugs. Those drugs will be delayed until we fix these things, and there is a will to fix them.
And investing in the community was for me, is one of the things that links this discussion with our earlier discussion, and does seem like the window where we could make a big investment and make a big impact very quickly.
Yeah, we have examples of where just lessons learned from COVID-19, how much we have invested in deliberate and intentional investment in the expertise of our community organizations, where we have a group of faith organizations that have totally impacted our clinical trial participation for vaccines, a group of community health workers who are fantastically engaged in our community, investing in not just them, but the organizations, the community-rooted Black organizations. And we can see the difference. So there's so much evidence of it working. But without honest investment, equitable investment that recognizes the expertise that they bring, and that I said earlier that we would not be able to do without them, I think we'll still be at the same space. But we have to be really genuine about what that looks like.
So I do a lot of work with COVID-19, and Nadine, you're absolutely right. Here in Louisiana, we have a health equity task force, and we make the efforts to try to go into the neighborhoods, get people vaccinated. Now, you can read the New York Times, Google it for yourself, or use whatever search engine. There are more whites than Blacks. They're disproportionately whites than Blacks getting the vaccine. And even in areas which historically underserved, South Central, certain parts of New York, the whites come in, people with means, and go to the community centers and get vaccinated more than the people in the community. I don't know how we're going to overcome that.
I just want to challenge something that was said about it taking too long. I don't think that that's the case. I haven't seen any data that it takes longer. It's just capabilities, and pharma could do anything. We've already seen that. So if there's a mandate, pharma will do it, and it won't take longer, because we do know that it doesn't take longer to engage and include diverse populations in clinical trials if those capabilities are in place. So I think we shouldn't contribute to the myths that are out there, which is that it takes too long and it's too hard, because it isn't.